Unaccountable leadership. This is hard to contextualize in a social media type movement, but let's see what we do. Dealings of leadership are kept secret from members. Institutional financial records, private teachings, relevant business and social relationships of the leaders are hidden from the view of the members. Critics of this secrecy are demonized.
There are certain people that can't be questioned. Essentially, there's a hierarchy, and I'm not sure if this is controversial to say or not, but I feel like trans women get treated better in the trans community, or at least they are seen as like the ultimate victims, especially if they're not white. So it's trans women of color. They're like the people who are put on a pedestal who can do no wrong, that sort of
Hmm.
thing. So I did realize, like, for example, one example I can think of is like on Tumblr, I watched a trans woman insult a trans man by telling him he had a tiny dick, because he does, and he doesn't really have one at all, to be honest. And when I thought about that, I was like, you're inducing dysphoria in this person because you're mad at whatever they're saying. But if someone did that to you, we would all be like fully canceled right now. If someone had said
Hmm.
that trans woman anything about their body, then no one would be getting away with it. So I felt like they had almost a sort of protection based on their identity. And this is very much a social justice thing. It's very identitarian, where there are just, the more identities you have, it feels like the more you're able to get away with. Yeah, one of the things that I have heard from many, and actually not even just, I was going to say there's a lot of sexual assault going on, specifically of trans women sexually assaulting trans men, but also trans women sexually assaulting other trans women, especially younger trans women.
So I had like all these little peak trans moments, kind of, where I noticed like the narcissist males who were in charge, or how like they were silencing female victims of sexual assault within the community. Like trans men being assaulted by trans women is actually pretty common, but you're not allowed to talk about it because it's enforcing transphobic stereotypes.
So that does happen a lot, and it does seem like they are able to get away with it. So that's what I think of when I think of unaccountable
Hmm.
leadership, is that these are people that are seen to be higher up on that hierarchy, who are able to do things and nobody does anything about it. And I think not even just, the only difference is that they're not really leaders.
This was something that came up in some of the peak resilience stories, where you have what are young teenage girls that their entryway was Tumblr, and they become more and more active, and then they start becoming involved in the trans community locally, and that's where they first encounter some of the things that we're starting to hear more and more of, which is where you have trans women who may be a little bit older suddenly in these activist community groups dealing with trans men who are younger, and then they start introducing more sexualized topics into things, where if you were to just take the trans element out of it and look at that in any other context, you'd say there's some red flags here, that there is behavior we wouldn't really accept in any other paradigm. But because there seems to be a close relationship between the trans community and trans activism and kink, or what's described as sex positivity, they seem to be blended together, where in addition to that sort of radical tolerance where we don't want to draw boundaries in how people identify or express themselves as gender, then we also don't want to demonize any particular sexual proclivity or sexual interest that somebody has. And those communities then interplay a lot. But the stories from these young, now desisted women, where that was an opportunity for them to be prey to people who would be seen as sexual predators in any other context.
You
It's
mentioned trans youth group. Who leads these things, and who are the high
uh,
priests of this on the internet?
so often these trans youth groups are led by older trans people. Um, it makes sense to me. Like if you had a gay youth group, you'd want it to be led by a gay person, right? But the problem is, if you're unsure about your gender, or if you want to transition and you go to these kinds of groups, you immediately see somebody that did what you want to do. So it's like not even a question of can I do it. It's like, oh, they're trans, I want to be trans. There I go. Like, this is my path. They're going to help me. That's it. Like, so there's no step of questioning, really.
Yeah.
So in my thing, I wrote about Morgan Page. I don't know if you know who she is, or he is a trans woman. But they had what do you call a workshop at Planned Parenthood Toronto about overcoming the cotton stealing, which was basically like a pickup artisty thing for trans women to hook up with lesbians.
Yeah.
This was in 2012. I was completely out of my periphery. I didn't hear about it until after I left the trans community, and I didn't realize that was the person who had been leading my trans youth group for 3 years until after I left.
Huh.
This person in the trans youth group, it was kind of like Tumblr come alive. We discussed erotic fan fiction. We discussed like specific techniques for doing specific sexual acts. We discussed like kinky stuff. We talked about porn. And the most disturbing thing was like, it was similar to that other C16 story. There was like always like less than 4 trans men, and they were all under the age of 18. And there was always more than like 5 trans women or non-binary males who were like over the age of 20. So the power dynamic in the room was always very off. Like, so when they were discussing sexual stuff, sometimes Morgan would turn to us and be like, oh, is this cool with you guys? But it's like, if it's not cool with one of us and we're younger and we're sitting at a big table, we're not going to tell everybody to stop talking. And especially when you consider like, this is an insecure teenage female, basically. So yeah, it was like, everything on Tumblr was becoming real life for me. I once knew a 14-year-old trans man who was in a relationship with like a 25-year-old trans woman, and like the trans woman was the dom and the trans man was the sub. So what you have is like a 25-year-old male who has like a sub who's like a 14-year-old girl. What is that? That's pedophilia. Like, what is that? That's sexual abuse. But for some reason, in the trans community, because the younger one is considered to be the man, it's like fine. Or because it's like kinky and we're in like a sex positive environment, it's unquestionable. So there would be like us trans men who were like under the age of 18, all of us, probably under the age of 16 during this story. And there was these trans women who were in their 40s, and they came in and they were literally hitting on us, and they were like being very explicit and very sexual about our bodies. And it's like, we have dysphoria. We came here to talk about our dysphoria, our trans stuff. And they're like talking about like, I don't know, I don't want to say on camera, but very explicit things. And people, they didn't want to kick them out. They didn't want to tell them to stop. They just kept like changing the subjects. And I was shocked, because this is supposed to be a place for young people to come and explore and be safe. Like, what the hell is that? That's not safe. That's not a good like environment for exploration. Yeah. The only time they were ever kicked out, Morgan was away, and this other trans man filled in for her. And it's really telling to me that the only time that these predators were ever kicked out was when a trans man was in charge. So a female person who could relate to the females in the room who were being like objectified. Yeah.
Yeah.
And it sounds like what you're alluding to.
Yeah, it's similar. It seems to be a lot more prevalent than I thought it was. I didn't experience that very much, but I have heard so many stories about it. What I have heard, though, is not even just related to sexual things or sexuality, but there are a lot of, within the community, a lot of people become not unaccountable, but like, for whatever reason, they don't need to go through an accountability process because they've come out as trans. So maybe this is something slightly different, but basically people frequently using their identities to create new personas for themselves, and therefore they never have to take responsibility for any of the bad things they did before. So people who might have either sexually assaulted someone before, or they were a bad influence in the community before, they can suddenly rehabilitate themselves just by coming out as trans or non-binary. So that's, I think, another form of not having any accountability.
And it's hard to make any broad generalizations from these anecdotal things, but like even in the wider group of like religions, they have had to undergo a reckoning and an acknowledgement of the presence of predatory sexual behavior when someone gets in a position of influence and power and there are children involved. And so there are institutional safeguards that they have to think about in terms of vetting the background of any individual and having too deep leadership where there's not isolation of someone. All those safeguards that are in place for those contexts would appropriately be in place in any in-person communities. And there's that danger of the online communities where people may still engage in what is being called grooming behaviors or sexual predation. So that's certainly something that could fall under the unaccountable leadership, but that may be something we just don't know the scope of. Anything else in terms of unaccountable leadership that pops into your mind?
I don't think so. I think that's it.
The thing that occurs to me, some of the leaders that may arise just by necessity on this issue may be researchers who do and publish research that then justifies the claims of the group and the ideology. And we already talked about how this process of clinical medicine has the potential of being distorted because of how powerful these forces are, which means that the conclusions may not be relied upon. If the researchers themselves have this ideology, then they are in a position of leadership where they can add to the body of established medical literature that may be distorted by the ideology itself, is not an impartial assessment of things. And to the extent that they hide or exclude their data or misrepresent data, that's a potential source for unaccountable leadership. We'd like to think that the scientific process of academic journals and peer review would root those things out, but we're learning that entire journals themselves may be captured by the ideology, and things like the hoax papers point to that there may be a problem in that self-checking mechanism in certain journals. I see that as a potential form of unaccountable leadership, but it's hard to quantify how much an individual's experience was affected by that. I think that's a bigger picture thing.
As we see the ideology like putting itself more into more institutions, I see that as well. Like even if even the government is saying that transition is life-saving, then how do we hold the government accountable for that?
Yeah, and it's funny studying history where you see where are other cases where politics and ideology inserted themselves into science and medicine and agriculture. And there's this phenomenon called Lysenkoism that's called Lysenkoism because of this guy named Lysenko in Russia after their revolution, where he took the ideology of Leninism and communism and shaped his scientific study of agriculture around it. And it caused him to make all sorts of bad recommendations for how they should manage their crops, which led to widespread starvation and death.
This is Trofim Lysenko. Following Stalin's failed efforts to collectivize agricultural production, causing between 7 and 14 million people to starve to death, the geneticist Lysenko claimed he had the answers to mass-produce crops to make it work. Lysenko threw out the established science of the West, dismissing it because it allowed too much of a role to individual actors, contrary to the focus of communist ideology. Lysenko told Soviet leadership exactly what they wanted to hear, and as a former peasant and member of the Communist Party, he was exactly who they wanted to hear it from. But no matter how much the Soviets wanted Lysenko's pseudoscience to be true, it wasn't. Famines caused by instituting Lysenko's theories killed tens of millions of people across the Soviet Union and Maoist China.
But the thing was, if anyone disagreed with him or dissented from him, then they would get removed from their position or outright killed because you could not go against the ideology.
After gaining the personal support of Stalin, scientists critical of Lysenko were purged and imprisoned as Lysenkoism became state-sanctioned doctrine.
So the precedent of Lysenkoism, knowing that we can have politics and ideology interfere with our mechanisms of science and our truth-telling institutions, should be caution that we need to be alert for when ideology is interfering with science and medicine here in the West.
As academia and medical research have become politicized, high-quality research casting doubt on affirmation has been suppressed, and low-quality research in its favor gets fast-tracked to publication. In 2020, the National Institute for Care and Health Excellence, NICE, the official body tasked with assessing the effectiveness of treatment options within Britain's National Health Service, produced reviews of the evidence for prescribing puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones for childhood and adolescent gender dysphoria. It ranked the standard of evidence as very low in every category it considered. every single study that found any benefit for puberty blockers, it concluded, could represent changes that are either of questionable clinical value, or the studies themselves are not reliable and changes could be due to confounding, bias, or chance. Solid evidence of benefits for cross-sex hormones prescribed to teenagers, it said, was similarly non-existent. One paper published in January 2020 in Pediatrics, a high-impact journal, claims that puberty blockers make it less likely that a person will consider suicide. But an analysis by Michael Biggs of Oxford University published a few months later in Archives of Sexual Behaviour, the journal edited by Ken Zucker, shows that it is catastrophically flawed. The analysis is based on data extracted from a low-quality, non-representative online survey. No attempt was made to ensure that respondents were in America, or to stop people responding repeatedly. Each response was entered into a prize draw. The survey is known to have elicited nonsensical answers about whether respondents had taken puberty blockers. Most who said they had were already older than 16 when the drugs were first used in gender medicine in the US. And finally, there was no attempt to adjust for pre-existing differences between those who took blockers, or said they had, and those who said they would have liked to. Clinicians would have been less likely to give the drugs to people with severe mental health issues, for example, who would then be more likely to contemplate suicide for reasons unrelated to not getting blockers. Another widely reported paper, also published in 2020, claimed that undergoing conversion therapy aimed at changing someone's gender identity is associated with worse future mental health. It too has been subjected to an article-length demolition by other researchers. It is based on the same flawed survey, and so is doomed before the data analysis even starts. But the problems do not stop there. The paper conflates all sorts of therapeutic interactions: voluntary and coerced, those with diagnostic and therapeutic aims, those where the primary purpose is related to gender identity, and those where it is not. Anyone who had detransitioned was excluded, a serious omission, since such people are among those most likely to have been harmed by gender affirmation. The survey provided no information on respondents' initial state of mental health, making it plausible that those who remembered more interactions with therapists were the ones who had worse mental health to begin with. And finally, the main result, that people who reported more interactions also reported worse mental health, is based on a measure of perceptions of distress, which is by no means the same thing. Despite the lack of evidence, the American Academy of Pediatrics, AAP, claims that gender affirmation is the only ethical treatment for gender dysphoric children. Its position paper was written by an activist-led subcommittee and is so far from evidence-based that a paper debunking it point by point ran in the Journal of Sex and Marital Therapy in 2019. In order to ensure that the AAP could not later claim ignorance of his critique, the author, James Cantor, a Canadian sexologist, mailed it to the heads of the organisation's main committees. He received 3 confirmations of receipt, but no responses. "I largely wrote that paper to be used when someone brings a court case," he says. "That was why I wrote it the way I did, down to referring to specific sentences to make it easy to cite." The misrepresentations are egregious. Remarkably, not only did the AAP statement fail to include any of the actual outcomes literature on such cases, but it also misrepresented the contents of its citations, which repeatedly said the very opposite of what the AAP attributed to them, Cantor writes. For example, the AAP statement says that conversion therapy for children has proven not only unsuccessful, but also deleterious. But the sources it cites refer to sexual orientation, not gender identity, and therapy for adults, not children. The AAP told neither the truth nor the whole truth, he concludes, committing sins both of commission and of omission, asserting claims easily falsified by anyone caring to do any fact-checking at all. The lack of decent research and misrepresentation of findings mean gender affirmation cannot even be described as a risky experiment on children, since experiment implies someone, somewhere, is tracking outcomes and comparing them with other options. But what can be said with some certainty is that it is not so much a treatment for gender dysphoria as a means to ensure that cross-sex identification persists. That must be acknowledged when the costs and benefits are totted up.
And I fear that things like rapid onset gender dysphoria and how that was treated are red flags of that.
Ideology-twisting scholarship with dangerous consequences is a phenomenon hardly limited to the Soviet Union. It's happening here, right now, in America.
Okay, so Unaccountable Leadership.
Intense.
All right.